The call came at 8:17 on a Thursday morning when the rain was hitting the kitchen window like it had somewhere better to be. I know the exact time because I had been staring at the clock for nearly an hour, sitting at my sister's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Sleep hadn't come. It rarely came those first few weeks. When your entire life gets ripped out from under you, your body stops trusting the dark. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't one I recognized. Curiosity won. What followed were the first few seconds of silence, heavy, loaded silence, and then screaming. Not anger, panic. The kind of raw, animal sound a man makes when the walls of a reality he constructed entirely on lies suddenly cave in all at once. Sandra, what did you do? What did you do? I recognized the voice immediately. Marcus, my husband of 27 years. The man who had sold the house I spent 16 years earning through military service. The man who had quietly drained our daughter's entire college fund. The man who had disappeared to Florida with a woman half his age while I was halfway around the world serving my country. I sat very still. I didn't speak. I just held the phone and let the sound wash over me like something I had earned the right to hear. And for the first time in months, I smiled. Not because I enjoyed his suffering. Not because revenge had ever been the goal. I smiled because in that moment, I finally understood what my daughter had meant 3 months earlier when she looked across a sticky diner table, squeezed my hand, and said two words I hadn't understood then. We handled it. Let me take you back to where this really started. 3 months before that phone call, I stepped off a military transport at Norfolk Naval Station, carrying a small duffel bag and 27 years of trust. At 54 years old, I wasn't some fresh faced officer anymore. The gray had long since taken over my temples. My knee gave me grief whenever the weather shifted. My shoulder had its own opinions about humidity. 16 years of active service had carved themselves into my body the way rivers carve canyons, slowly, permanently, beautifully in certain lights and brutally in others. But I had never regretted a single day. Every deployment, every missed birthday, every holiday spent in a temporary bunk overseas, every phone call that cut out at the worst possible moment, all of it was supposed to be building something. A future, a foundation, a life worth coming home to. I had called Marcus from the airport. No answer. That wasn't unusual. I told myself he was busy, maybe napping, maybe just ignoring his phone the way he sometimes did. I told myself a lot of things that morning. The drive from Norfolk to our neighborhood took 45 minutes. I knew every turn by memory. Every maple tree, every faded white fence, the particular way the light fell across our street on overcast mornings. After years away, those familiar details always hit me somewhere deep. That specific kind of homecoming ache you can only feel when you've been gone long enough to miss the ordinary things. Then I turned onto our street and saw the moving truck. My first thought was completely rational. A neighbor was relocating. It happened. I even thought about whether I should stop and say goodbye. Then I read the address on the side of the truck. My address. I pulled over so hard the tires screamed. Two men were carrying furniture through the front door. My furniture. The armchair Marcus had bought for our 15th anniversary. The bookshelf I'd hauled back from a posting overseas. The lamp from our bedroom that I'd always meant to replace and somehow never did. I crossed the lawn in something between a walk and a run. What are you doing? One of the movers looked up with the polite confusion of someone who has been interrupted doing something completely ordinary. Moving in the new owners, ma'am. The sentence didn't process. It bounced around in my skull like a marble in an empty room. What new owners? The people who bought the house. I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, because the alternative to laughing in that moment was simply falling apart on the front lawn, and I had spent 16 years in uniform learning not to do that. A woman appeared in the doorway, 30s, kind face, holding a set of keys that didn't belong to her. Are you Sandra Mitchell? My stomach dropped through the earth. She didn't say much after that. She didn't need to. She and her husband had legally purchased the property 6 weeks earlier. All paperwork had cleared, the title had transferred, the sale was final. I stood in the driveway in the rain and let those words rearrange everything I thought I knew about my life. I don't remember driving away. I only remember a gas station parking lot and the sound of rain on the roof of my car and my own hands shaking against the steering wheel like they belonged to someone else. LSC. I called Marcus, voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. Then I called my daughter. Nadia answered on the second ring. The moment I heard her voice, calm, steady, immediately present, I came apart in a way I hadn't since the very worst days of deployment. Not elegant tears, something closer to collapse. The kind of falling apart that happens when you've held the seams together for so long that finally letting someone else hold you feels like surrendering to gravity. Sweetheart, I managed. He sold the house. There was a pause. Not surprise, not confusion. A pause that sounded, impossibly, like preparation. Where are you right now? She asked. Nadia was 22 years old, and she had always been the kind of person who made you feel slightly more capable just by being in the room. She found me at a diner off Interstate 64, sitting in a corner booth with an untouched cup of coffee. When she slid into the seat across from me, she reached for my hand immediately. No preamble, no performance, just contact. How? I asked. That was all I could manage. How does a man spend 27 years beside you and then do this? She held my hand tighter. There's more, she said quietly. I felt the bottom drop out of something that had already been falling. In retrospect, I think some part of me had known, even before the moving truck, that the house wasn't the whole story. Marcus had been distant for months before my final deployment. Not dramatically distant, not in a way that would have triggered real alarm. Just slightly unavailable in the way people become when they're managing two lives and running low on the energy required to convincingly perform the one you're supposed to be living. I had attributed it to stress, to age, to the particular friction that builds up in long marriages like sediment in a pipe, slowly, invisibly, until the water stops flowing right and you can't quite identify why. I had been wrong about what it was. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me. Bank statements, account records, transfer histories going back years, numbers that started small and then became so large they stopped feeling real. I watched the money disappear in columns. My money, the deployments, the bonuses, the allowances, the savings I had been quietly building for decades like someone stacking stones against a flood. The college fund, Nadia said. She said it carefully, like she was delivering a wound rather than words. I closed my eyes. Not because of my own loss, because the money in that fund wasn't mine. It was hers. Every birthday check, every holiday deposit, every bonus I had quietly rooted into her future instead of my own comfort. That fund was every parent's silent promise. Whatever happens to me, you will be okay. How much? I whispered. Almost all of it. I pressed my hands flat against the table. I needed something solid. Nadia waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. Where is he? Florida, she looked at the window. He's been there for a while. With her. Her name is Crystal, she's 32. 32, younger than our marriage. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was something quieter and in some ways worse, the particular humiliation of being the last person to know. The neighbors had known. The bank had known. The real estate agents, the title company, the movers. Half of Virginia, it seemed, had known before me. I stared out the rain-streaked diner window and tried to locate something in myself that felt like a future. Then Nadia did something I didn't expect. She closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, and smiled. Not a happy smile, not a cruel one either. A knowing smile. The kind of expression someone wears when they've been holding a secret they're finally allowed to release. Mom, she said, don't worry. Nadia, we handled it. Past tense. Not we'll handle it, not we can fix this. Handled, already done, completed. For the first time all day, I forgot about my own pain entirely. My younger sister Carolyn had insisted I come stay with her the moment she heard what happened. Her fury on my behalf was magnificent and slightly terrifying. If Marcus sets foot near my house, she announced while making up the guest bed, I will personally drive him back to Florida myself, in the trunk. It was the first real laugh I'd managed in days. The next evening, Nadia came to Carolyn's house with her laptop and a calm she had no business possessing at 22. She sat down at the small desk in the guest room, opened a series of folders on her screen, and turned to look at me. Before I explain any of this, she said, I need you to understand something. I waited. I didn't find out about this last week. The air in the room changed. What? I've known for almost 10 months. I stared at her. 10 months was not a number I was prepared for. 10 months ago, I had been in the middle of a deployment. 10 months ago, I had been sending voice messages home. ND planning the meals I would cook when I returned and believing, with the comfortable certainty of someone who has never been deceived, that the life I was protecting was actually intact. Why didn't you tell me? Pain moved across her face. Real pain, not guilt, something more complicated. Because at first I wasn't certain. And then, when I was certain, she stopped, started again. I didn't want to pull you away from your duty. You were serving, Mom. I didn't want to be the reason you came home distracted. I opened my mouth, closed it. And then, she continued, voice dropping slightly, I realized that anger wasn't going to get us anything. Evidence would. So I decided to focus on evidence. She clicked open the first folder. It had started, Nadia explained, with small things. Restaurant charges on a shared credit card that didn't match Marcus's version of his week. Hotel bookings in cities he'd claimed to visit for work. Jewelry purchases, substantial ones, during months when he'd told me money was tight. Weekend transactions that appeared on no calendar he had ever mentioned. She'd noticed the first inconsistency a year ago. By the time she was certain something was wrong, she had filled an entire digital folder. When did you tell Carolyn? I asked, looking at my sister. Carolyn raised one hand. She called me 8 months ago. 8 months. The two of them had been quietly building something while I was overseas, while I was sleeping soundly in the belief that my family was fine. They had eventually reached out to a retired military attorney named Richard Calloway, a man who had spent 30 years navigating exactly these kinds of cases involving service members and marital assets. Richard had looked at what they brought him and identified several things that warranted much closer scrutiny, particularly around the property sale documentation. They had also spoken privately with our longtime financial advisor, a careful man named Walter Drummond, who had worked with our family for 15 years. Walter couldn't share account specifics, but he could point Nadia toward the right questions, the patterns, the red flags, the places where a paper trail becomes something that professionals take seriously. A family friend with a background in banking compliance had reviewed publicly available information and identified further concerns, not definitive findings, but enough to justify investigation. One by one, Nadia had assembled a team of professionals around a folder of evidence, and none of them had told me a word. You were building a case, I said slowly. Nadia nodded. While he thought no one was looking, while he was absolutely certain no one was looking, she said, that was sort of the point. She crossed the room, opened the drawer of the filing cabinet Carolyn kept in the guest room, and removed a folder so thick it required both hands. She set it on the table in front of me. I looked at it, then at her. She smiled again, that same composed, quietly triumphant smile. He thinks he won, she said. That's exactly why he's about to lose everything. The following Monday, I met Richard Calloway in his office near Hampton Roads. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, soft-spoken, with the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough human disaster to stop being surprised by any of it. Photographs of military families covered every inch of wall space. He handed me coffee before I'd even finished sitting down. Sandra Mitchell, he said, your daughter speaks very highly of you. I've been learning to return the sentiment, I told him. He smiled and opened his file, Nadia's file. Before we discuss options, he said, I want to say something that I suspect you need to hear. I braced. What happened to you was not your fault. The words hit somewhere I hadn't protected. For months, I had been sitting with a particular species of shame that military people know well, the shame of missing something you should have caught. I was trained to assess threats. I had spent 16 years learning to read situations, identify risks, plan for contingencies. And somehow I had failed to notice a years-long deception unfolding at my own dinner table. Richard seemed to read my expression. People who betray trust are usually experts at concealing it, he said. Your husband spent years constructing a false reality with great care. The failure is his. The fact that he was convincing is not a reflection of your intelligence. I nodded slowly. I didn't entirely believe him yet, but I filed it away. He turned several pages. There are a few concerns with the property documentation. I sat forward. The signatures on several closing documents require professional review. You think they were forged? He chose his words with the precision of someone who had learned exactly how much each one costs. I think they deserve scrutiny from a document examiner. He looked at me over his reading glasses. And once that scrutiny begins, other parties become involved. Title companies, lenders, people who take disclosure requirements very seriously. For the first time since I had found strangers living in my house, something in my chest loosened. Not victory, something smaller and more sustainable than victory. Possibility. Meanwhile, Marcus had apparently decided that the best way to handle the consequences of destroying his family was to post about it online. Nadia showed me the screenshots on a quiet evening at Carolyn's house. Photos from Florida, sun-soaked restaurants, waterfront weekends, Crystal in every frame, young and laughing, the picture of a woman who had no idea, or perhaps didn't care, that the lifestyle she was enjoying had been funded by a veteran's 16 years of sacrifice. The comments underneath were the kind that made my teeth ache. Living your best life, so happy for you, you deserve this. He had rewritten himself entirely. In his new narrative, he was a brave man who had finally chased happiness, not a husband who had abandoned his family, not a father who had stolen his daughter's future, just a middle-aged man following his heart. I should have been furious. Mostly, I felt something more like grief, because the man in those photos looked desperate, like someone who needed the world to believe he was happy because he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Does it bother you? Nadia asked, seeing that. I thought about it honestly. It bothers me less than I expected. She nodded, good. What bothers me, I said, is how long it went on. How many times I must have been on a call with him while he was standing in a hotel lobby somewhere, and he just lied, without effort. Nadia was quiet for a moment, then, I think that's what he wasn't prepared for. You weren't angry, you were organized. She was right, and that distinction was going to matter. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Nadia called while I was helping Carolyn repot some plants on the back porch. One of his accounts has been flagged for review. I put down the trowel, flagged how. Temporary hold, they're reviewing transactions. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't a charge. It was a question. But questions were exactly what Marcus had built his entire scheme to avoid, and now questions were arriving from multiple directions at once. From Richard's office, from document examiners, from financial institutions, from the attorney representing the original property sale, who had suddenly needed considerably more documentation than expected. Each new request for information forced Marcus to explain something he had assumed would never be examined. I had spent my career in an institution that understood the power of patient, methodical process. The military doesn't usually solve problems with dramatic gestures. It solves them with documentation, with procedure, with the slow accumulation of verified fact. I recognized what was happening around Marcus, and I understood it in my bones. Truth was working, not revenge truth. The system was moving at the speed of institutional process, which is to say, slowly and without mercy. I want to say something about that period. Those months of watching a methodical process do what emotional reaction never could. People who have been betrayed tend to fantasize about dramatic confrontations. The phone call where you say exactly the right thing, the moment of public exposure, the look on someone's face when they finally understand the full weight of what they've done. I had those fantasies, most nights if I'm honest. But what actually dismantles a carefully constructed deception isn't drama. It's paperwork. It's professionals asking reasonable questions and requiring documented answers. It's the slow accumulation of facts in the hands of people whose job is to follow facts wherever they lead. Marcus had planned for confrontation. He knew me well enough to expect anger. He had probably rehearsed responses during all those months of planning. He had a story ready, some version, where he was the one who had been unhappy, where the marriage had quietly failed long before he left, where he was simply the first person willing to acknowledge what both people already knew. What he hadn't anticipated was Nadia and a retired military attorney and a document examiner, and a financial institution's compliance team, all arriving at similar conclusions from entirely different directions simultaneously. He hadn't planned for organized, documented professional truth. And in the end, that was the only thing that had the power to dismantle what he had built. Through mutual acquaintances, Nadia kept hearing small updates about the situation in Florida. Crystal, it turned out, had expensive preferences. This was not unusual or criminal, but it was expensive. Designer things, travel, the kind of lifestyle that requires a stable and substantial income to maintain without anxiety, and Mark. Us's income was becoming increasingly unstable and increasingly anxious. Every week brought another complication, another document request, another review, another reminder that the past he had left behind in Virginia was not staying buried. The social media posts became less frequent. The couple photos disappeared first, then the beach shots, then the restaurant check ins. One evening, Nadia showed me Crystal's most recent post, a solo photo, a sunset behind her, a vague caption about finding your own path. Nadia raised an eyebrow. I laughed, a genuine one, the kind I hadn't expected to have for a while. I don't hate her, I said, surprising myself. Nadia looked at me carefully. She wasn't the cause, I said. She was just standing at the finish line when he decided to run. The problem was always Marcus's choices. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then, he expected anger from you. That was his plan. Anger he could defend against. And instead he got Carolyn, and a retired military attorney, and a very organized 22-year-old. She smiled. He really didn't see that coming. Autumn arrived, and with it, the document review findings. Richard called me early on a Tuesday with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to make a phone call for a long time. Sandra, I'd like you to sit down. I laughed. Every time you say that, my heart rate does something unpleasant. This time it's warranted, he said. The document examination results came back. And several signatures have been flagged as requiring further investigation. A pause. This is now being referred to appropriate authorities. I sat with that for a moment. Months earlier, it had been a suspicion. Nadia had said the signatures don't look right in the way someone says something when they're trying not to overstate what they know. And I had looked at those closing documents and felt a cold certainty I hadn't allowed myself to voice. Now professionals were saying it too. What happens next? I asked. More questions, Richard said, for everyone involved. For Marcus. Especially for Marcus. After I hung up, I sat alone in Carolyn's kitchen and thought about my daughter, the little girl who had drawn elaborate treasure maps in crayon and left them around the house for me to find before deployments, so I'd always have something to come home to. The teenager who had stayed up late helping me rehearse for promotion boards over the phone. The young woman who had spent 10 months quietly, carefully, methodically protecting her mother, while her mother was busy protecting everyone else. I had spent 16 years believing that my job was to protect my family. I had missed the fact that my family was protecting me right back. Crystal left in November. There was no dramatic scene, no public confrontation. She simply packed and then she was gone. According to what filtered back through the people who knew them, she had finally done the math. Marcus wasn't the man she had believed him to be, the confident, financially comfortable person who had swept her into a life of easy luxury. He was a middle-aged man sinking under the weight of legal complications, financial reviews, and a past that refused to cooperate with his narrative. The adventure wasn't exciting anymore, it was exhausting. She made the entirely reasonable decision to leave before it got worse. When Nadia told me, I sat with it for a moment, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. Nothing came, just a quiet, gray sadness for the whole situation. An entire family dissolved. A marriage of 27 years reduced to legal filings and social media silence. Decades of trust thrown away for something that hadn't even lasted 2 years. Nobody wins in stories like this. Some people just lose more than others. A few days later, I received a call from Marcus's older brother, Franklin. We had always gotten along. He was a decent man who had watched his brother make increasingly poor choices over the years, with the specific pain of someone who sees exactly what's happening and can do nothing about it. He sounded tired. Sandra, I wanted you to know he's not doing well. I watched bare tree branches move against the November sky. Crystal left, I said. He didn't think she would, Franklin exhaled. I don't think he understands how any of this happened. That sentence almost made me laugh. How it happened seemed perfectly clear from where I was standing. It happened the way all disasters happen, one small compromise at a time, one self-serving choice at a time, until the accumulation of small betrayals becomes a catastrophe too large to contain. I'm sorry to hear he's struggling, I said, and I meant it. Not the way you mean something when you're being polite. I meant it the way you mean something when you've finally let go of the need for the other person to suffer. That evening, Nadia and I sat on Carolyn's back porch watching the last of the autumn. Light drained from the sky. How are you feeling? She asked. It was the question she asked every few days now, and she asked it like she actually wanted the precise answer, not the convenient one. I thought about it carefully. Not angry, I said finally. She nodded, good. I thought I would be. I thought that was what I was supposed to feel. What do you feel instead? I considered ready. She looked at me. Ready for whatever comes next, I said, which is something I haven't felt since I walked off that transport. She reached over and squeezed my hand. We sat in silence for a while as the fireflies began to appear in the yard, blinking their small lights against the dark like someone sending a message in a code I was just beginning to understand. The final hearings took place in early December. Richard had warned me there would be nothing dramatic about them. No courtroom revelations, no surprise witnesses, no moments of cinematic justice. Just rooms full of professionals and stacks of paper and the slow, grinding machinery of institutional truth-telling. He was right, it was largely boring, exquisitely, beautifully boring. But underneath all that paperwork was something that didn't need spectacle to be powerful. Evidence. Nadia's evidence. 10 months of documented transfers, flagged transactions, questioned signatures, traced withdrawals, and careful preparation. All of it now in the hands of people whose professional purpose was to follow it wherever it led. I answered questions, I provided records, I clarified timelines, I confirmed details. It reminded me, strangely, of the best kind of military operation, not the dramatic ones, but the precise ones. The ones where careful preparation made the outcome almost inevitable. The truth had simply been given enough room to do what truth does when it's handled correctly. Richard called on a gray afternoon in mid-December, with the unmistakable energy of someone delivering the conclusion of something long in progress. Sandra, he said, sit down. This time I didn't laugh, I sat immediately. Several matters have been resolved, he said. The college fund. I stopped breathing. A substantial portion has been recovered and will be returned. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because of what the money represented for me, because of what it represented for Nadia. Every birthday gift that had gone into that account instead of a toy. Every holiday when I'd asked family to contribute to her future instead of something she could hold. Every deployment bonus I'd rooted quietly into her security. It was all still there, most of it given back. My eyes filled with tears, which surprised me. I had thought I was past the easy crying. There are additional settlements regarding marital assets, Richard continued. I want to be honest with you, nothing fully restores what was taken. That's not how these things work, but the outcome is fair, significantly better than where we started. Richard, I said, what you said in your office that first day. What's that? That it wasn't my fault, I paused. I believe it now. A beat of silence. Good, he said quietly. I'm glad. When I told Nadia that evening, she cried. This stunned me more than almost anything that had happened in the previous months. My daughter, the one who had held steady through all of it, the one who had never flinched, who had approached the entire crisis with the composure of someone twice her age, sat in Carolyn's kitchen and let tears run down her face without trying to stop them. I pulled her into my arms. We stood there for a long time without saying much. Sometimes relief doesn't need language. Sometimes it just needs to be felt. 3 days before Christmas, at exactly 8:17 in the morning, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. The first sounds were chaos, rapid breathing, stumbling words, the frantic energy of someone whose world has just finished collapsing. And then, cutting through all of it, his voice. Sandra, what did you do? What did you do? The final judgment had reached him. The paperwork, the settlements, the accountability, formal, documented, unavoidable, that had arrived at his door in Florida on a Thursday morning, shattering whatever remained of the fantasy he'd been maintaining. I held the phone and felt remarkably calm. What happened, Marcus? He exploded, blamed, accused, rambled through everything he had lost, everything he hadn't expected, everything that had gone wrong with his perfect plan to start over without consequences. The words came in a flood, accusations, self-pity, confusion, the particular anger of someone who had been so certain of their victory that the reality of defeat felt like an assault. I listened to all of it. I let him run. Eventually, his voice changed. The anger drained out of it. What was left underneath was something smaller and quieter, and in some ways more difficult to hear. Fear, not of prison or public judgment, not even of financial ruin. He was afraid because he had finally, clearly, irrevocably understood what he had destroyed. His marriage, his relationship with Nadia, his integrity, his future. And some losses, as he was learning, cannot be recovered the way money can. The call stretched on. When his voice had quieted to nearly nothing, he asked a question so softly I almost missed it. Did I ruin everything? 27 years sat inside that question. Vacations and arguments and Sunday mornings, and the particular silence of a house when everyone inside it is content. The first apartment we'd shared, small enough that you could touch both walls in the hallway. The years when money was tight and we had laughed about it, because we were in it together and together felt like enough. The day Nadia was born, and the way Marcus had cried in a way I had never witnessed from him before or since. A lifetime of ordinary moments that no legal settlement can quantify, and no amount of wrongdoing can fully erase from memory. Did I ruin everything? I knew the honest answer. He had ruined a great deal. He had ruined the house, the fund, the financial security I had assembled over 16 years of sacrifice. He had ruined the version of the future I had been quietly constructing since I was young enough to believe that love, by itself, was a kind of protection. But everything was not the same as a great deal. Nadia was still there, my integrity was intact. My career, my service record, the relationships I had built over decades, none of those things had ever been within Marcus's power to take, even when he tried to strip everything else away. I closed my eyes. You ruined a lot, Marcus, I said, yes. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I've ever held. I stayed on the line long enough to hear something I hadn't expected. Underneath the fear, underneath the self-pity, underneath the ruin of everything he'd tried to build, genuine remorse. Not the performative kind. The real kind. The kind that understands damage rather than just consequences. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, while the rain tapped against the window, and the coffee cooled in my mug. There was nothing left to fight. I had imagined this moment for months. I had imagined it would feel triumphant, some clean, cinematic moment of justice landing perfectly. I had imagined satisfaction, closure, the specific relief of watching someone get exactly what they deserved. What I felt instead was tired. Not broken tired. Finished tired. The way you feel after a long deployment when the transport finally touches down and you know the mission is complete and now you just need to find the next thing. A week after Christmas, Richard asked me a question I hadn't been prepared for. What are you going to do now? I blinked now. With your life, he said, the recovery phase is ending, Sandra. What comes next? For months, every piece of my attention had been absorbed by crisis, by fighting back, by documenting and defending and reclaiming. That had been necessary, that had been right, but Richard was pointing to something beyond it. Life continuing. The answer arrived a few nights later from an unexpected direction. Nadia appeared in Carolyn's living room carrying a notebook. She sat beside me on the couch, opened it, and began turning pages. Travel destinations, housing options, volunteer programs, community organizations that worked with military families, a handwritten list of courses she thought I might enjoy. What is all this? I asked. She looked at me with an expression that was somehow both practical and full of love. Your future, she said. She pointed to one page. You spent 16 years serving other people. Another, you spent 27 years taking care of dad. Another, you spent 22 years raising me. Her voice caught just slightly. Maybe, she said, it's finally your turn. I couldn't speak for a moment. She was right. For the first time in decades, I had choices, not obligations, not responsibilities I'd inherited or accepted or sacrificed for, actual choices, a future that was genuinely open. The realization was equal parts terrifying and luminous. The meeting happened in early February. Franklin had called to say Marcus was asking to see me. I had sat with the request for almost a week before agreeing to it. Neutral ground, a public park near Williamsburg. A cold morning with children playing in the distance and dogs being walked along the far path, and all of ordinary life continuing as it always does, indifferent to individual catastrophe. I arrived first. I sat on a bench and watched my breath fog in the winter air and thought about what I wanted from this conversation. Not resolution, not restoration, not even apology particularly. Just truth, the same thing that had gotten us through all of this. I saw him coming from a distance. I recognized his walk before his face, the particular rhythm of it, unchanged aft. Our 27 years, but everything else was different. The confidence was gone. The assurance that had carried him through years of deception, years of planning, years of believing he was the cleverest person in any room, all of it had vanished. The man walking toward me looked smaller than the one I remembered, more human, more afraid. He sat down, neither of us spoke for a moment. Thank you for coming, he said finally. Franklin asked, I said, and I had some things I wanted to hear. He nodded, he looked at his hands. I don't expect forgiveness. His voice had lost its polish. This was the unperformed version of Marcus, and it was strange and sad to meet him here, after everything. I'm not sure I deserve it. You probably don't, I said, not yet. He looked up. But I'm not interested in carrying this, I told him. I'm not interested in spending the next 20 years being angry at you. That's not a life. He was quiet. I thought I was chasing something I'd been missing, he said. I told myself I deserved more. I convinced myself that the life we had wasn't enough. He swallowed. And somewhere in that story, I stopped seeing what I actually had. For a moment, something almost like grief passed between us, not for what we were, for what we had been long ago before everything. Nadia arrived 20 minutes later. Marcus stood immediately when he saw her. He hadn't known she was coming. His face did something complicated. She looked at him with the same composure she had maintained through 10 months of secret preparation, through the worst period of our family's history, through everything. I owe you an apology, he said. You do, she agreed. He struggled for words. I'm sorry, Nadia, for all of it. She let the apology land. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't amplify it. She received it like someone who had decided in advance to accept the real thing if it came. Then she asked him one question, simple, direct. Why? He thought about it for a long moment, and then he answered with the only honest thing he had to offer. I got selfish. 4 words, the entire disaster, reduced to its truth. We talked for nearly an hour, not about settlements or signatures or account numbers. Those things were settled. We talked about what happens after, about whether people can repair themselves once they've understood the full extent of the damage they've caused, about what forgiveness actually means versus what people expect it to mean. When he finally asked me directly, "Can you ever forgive me?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the house, the fund, the lies, hundreds of them, carefully maintained over years. I thought about standing in a driveway in the rain, finding out my home was gone. I thought about Nadia's face in that diner when she said we handled it, and I hadn't yet understood what she meant. And then I thought about the alternative, carrying all of this forward into whatever years I had left, letting his choices poison my future the way they'd already damaged my past. Yes, I said. His eyes filled. But I want you to understand what that means and what it doesn't. I held his gaze. It doesn't mean trust is restored. It doesn't mean things return to what they were. Some doors close for good, and that's not a punishment, it's just what's true. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as forgetting. It doesn't rewrite history. It just means I'm choosing peace over resentment. For my sake, not yours. He nodded, he seemed to understand. In the months that followed, limited contact returned. Slowly, carefully, mostly through Nadia, who managed it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. There was no dramatic reunion, no hallmark resolution. Life doesn't grant those. But there was healing, real healing. The kind built one honest conversation at a time, one responsible choice at a time, one ordinary day at a time. And that, as it turned out, was enough. Somewhere in the weeks between Richard's final call and the February meeting in the park, I went to a veterans breakfast in Hampton that I hadn't planned on attending. It had been years since I'd gone to one. Military life has a way of keeping you too busy to attend the events designed to acknowledge the life you're living. But Carolyn had suggested it, and I was running out of excuses to stay in her guest room indefinitely, so I went. The room was full of people my age, some older, retired Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard, men and women who understood, without needing it explained, what it costs to serve. You don't have to narrate the missed birthdays in a room like that. You don't have to explain the particular weight of a phone call that drops at the worst moment, or what it feels like to fall asleep in a bunk overseas trying to remember the exact sound of your own home. People who have lived it carry it in the way they hold themselves, and everyone in that room recognized everyone else. I hadn't planned to talk about Marcus. I had specifically planned not to. But military communities are small and word travels, and before long people were asking how I was doing with the kind of careful directness that bypasses pleasantries entirely. And I found, somewhat to my surprise, that talking about it felt different here than it had anywhere else. Nobody pitied me. Nobody treated me like a casualty. Instead, they reminded me of things I had been so deep inside the crisis that I'd entirely forgotten. The sailors I had helped advance in their careers, the younger officers I had mentored through their first difficult assignments, the families I had supported through deployments and losses, and the particular bureaucratic nightmares that military life generates in abundance. The people I had trained, encouraged, promoted, advocated for. A retired chief petty officer I'd served with years ago gripped my hand and said something I carried out of that room and have not put down since. Sandra, he said, one bad man doesn't erase a good life. I thanked him and smiled and moved on to the next conversation. But I thought about that sentence all the way home. I thought about it for days. Because for months, I had been allowing Marcus's betrayal to retroactively color everything, as if the 27 years of marriage had contaminated everything before and after it, as if his choices had made a verdict on my judgment, my life, my value, as if the damage he'd caused was somehow evidence about who I was rather than who he turned out to be. The chief petty officer's sentence cut through all of that. One bad man, not a referendum on my entire existence. Not proof that I had been foolish or weak or undeserving. Just one man who had made terrible choices and a life that extended infinitely in all directions beyond him. I drove home slowly, the kind of slowly you do when you're turning something over in your mind and you need the extra time. By the time I pulled into Carolyn's driveway, something had settled in me that had been turbulent for months. I was not defined by what Marcus had taken. I was defined by what I had built, what I had survived, what I had protected, and, when it came to it, what my daughter had quietly assembled on my behalf while I wasn't looking. That was the story, not the theft, the recovery. When people ask what I learned from all of this, I usually pause before answering, because the easy answers are available and the true ones require more thought. Military service taught me discipline. It taught me to function under pressure, to sacrifice without resentment, to show up when showing up costs something. Those lessons served me well. But this experience taught me something harder. Character is the only thing that travels with you everywhere. Money can disappear, property can be taken, plans can collapse completely. The people you love most can make choices that shatter everything you built together. None of that is preventable. Life is not safe, and the people inside it are imperfect in ways that can sometimes be catastrophic. But integrity survives. It survives betrayal. It survives loss. It survives the particular darkness of discovering that someone you trusted completely was never entirely who you believed. Marcus lost sight of his integrity long before he lost anything else. That was the first domino. Nadia never lost sight of hers, not for a single day. And watching my daughter protect our family during the darkest season of our lives. Quietly, methodically, without drama, without self congratulation, with nothing but care and intelligence and an extraordinary faith that truth, given time and documentation, tends to do its own work, remains the thing I am most proud of in my entire life. Not the service, not the promotions, not the deployments survived. My daughter choosing to protect me when she could have simply grieved. If you have ever been betrayed, truly betrayed, by someone who had your complete trust, you know the particular quality of that silence after you first understand what happened. The way the world keeps moving, but you've gone still inside, trying to reconcile the person you knew with the person who did this. I want to tell you something about that silence. It ends. Not all at once, not cleanly, not on any timeline you can predict or control, but it ends. And when it does, what you often find on the other side isn't what you expected. You find yourself. Sometimes a version of yourself you hadn't met yet, one who knows things the previous version didn't, one who is capable of things that would have seemed impossible before. The people who hurt us do not get to write the ending of our story. That right belongs to no one but us. The worst chapter of your life is not your final chapter. It is simply the one that comes before you discover what you're actually made of. In my case, I needed a crisis to fully understand that my daughter was extraordinary. I needed to lose everything. And G to learn what I had been carrying all along without knowing its weight. I needed to come home to nothing to understand that home was never the house. It was her, it had always been her. And the most remarkable thing, the thing I return to whenever life feels uncertain or unfair, is that she never asked for recognition. She never announced what she was doing. She didn't need me to know until the moment I needed to know it. She simply did the work quietly, competently, with love so practical and clear eyed that it looked from a distance like strategy. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what love looks like when it grows up. Thank you for listening. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I hope you take a moment to think about the people who have stood beside you through your hardest seasons. The ones who didn't announce it, the ones who just stayed. Share this with someone who